Ever wondered about the origin, about our current explanation, at least in English, about the dropping of wine at the Seder? That's something we're going to explore in this episode of
The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life.
Welcome, everybody, to the newest episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm very excited to welcome Professor Rabbi Dr. or Dr. Rabbi Zvi Ron.
Yeah, that's fine. Either way is good.
Yeah, either order, doesn't matter.
I don't care.
Oh, great.
Yeah, you can just call me Tzvi, it's fine.
For those less familiar with Rabbi Dr. Zvi Ron, he received semikha from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate and PhD in Jewish Theology from Spertus University. He served as rabbi of Keneseth Beth Israel Synagogue for 10 years in Richmond, Virginia. Along with his wife, Sharon, they moved back to Israel in 2004 with their four children and live in Neve Daniel, Gush Etzion. He teaches at a number of yeshivot and seminaries in Jerusalem. He is the author of two books on Tanakh in Hebrew, Sefer Katan וגדול, and Sefer העיקר חסר, about the variable spellings of words in Tanakh. Rabbi Ron also has authored dozens of articles in numerous publications, and he is editor of the Jewish Bible Quarterly and was a contestant on The Weakest Link, which apparently is a point of pride for you, I guess.
It was what?
A point of pride for you?
Yeah, I put it in there because it's something to separate from the crowd a little bit,
It is certainly a rarity amongst rabbis.
Yeah.
Very, very neat. Okay, so the topic we're discussing today, Passover is on the horizon. It's coming up. And one of the practices that occur at the Seder is the spilling out or the dropping of wine. And for listeners who checked out a few years ago, Rabbi Dr. Zev Farber's episode on sort of the origins of this. Apparently, according to Rabbi Dr. Zvi Ron here, in not one but two separate articles, I actually came across it first with the Torah.com article, but apparently based on this Ḥakirah article for anybody who wants to read more in depth or just prefers, I guess, the writing aspect of it. So those are further investigative avenues that people can go in. Originally, anybody who wants to check out that Rabbi Dr. Zev Farber episode, they can see the medieval origins of the spilling out of the wine, where that comes from, and it's not really the greatest vis-a-vis our relationships with our Gentile neighbors.
Right, because the original explanation centers a lot around the number 16, because it is ultimately not just the Aseret HaDibrot, but also the three words before and the acronym after comes out 16. And this goes to the old idea of the 16-bladed sword of God that is used to wreak vengeance on our enemies. And that's what we're representing. And that's the Hasidei Ashkenaz, old Ashkenazic medieval approach. And that's where it really comes from. And all the old sources talk about it in that direction. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So actually, before we continue, can I just ask, how did you, stumble upon this item of research? How did you decide to pursue it?
I'll tell you what happened.
Yeah.
That I found that all these Haggadot give this explanation of that we do these drops because our joy is diminished at all of the Egyptians that died. So, first we'll say two things. Number one, it's interesting to me when everybody says something and nobody's quoting anybody, right? It's just like, so I'll give you an example. Look, I have this is a nice Haggadah, the Haggadah with answers, right? So it has answers to, that's its claim to fame. So Haggadah with answers.
Yeah.
So he asked the question why we do this. He says, the Ber Miriam says, the Maaseh Nisim says, the Gra says. Then he says, it is also possible to suggest another reason. All of a sudden, there's no attribution over there. And you see this in many, many Haggadot, that they just give it with no attribution. So that's already a mystery. Like, so what? It's funny to think everyone says it, but where did it come from? And then part two, well, there's, I guess, three parts. Part two is that some people say it came from the Abarbanel. But if you look up the Abarbanel, his commentary on the Haggadah, it's just not there. So number one, people are just attributing it to nobody. It's like in the street. And then they say it's a Abarbanel. It's not a Abarbanel. Then some people say it's the Avraham. You look up at the Avraham, it's not there either. So that's very mysterious. And then the other thing, which is what Rabbi Dr. Zev Farber said, is that this is a little bit of a funny concept to say, like, all of a sudden we're feeling bad for the Egyptians. It seems seems unusual. It seems not something that we're usually concerned with. Like on Purim, no one's like, I don't know, like kid number 5 of Haman, I don't know if he was such a bad guy. Like, we're not concerned with that. Zeresh, what did she? Nobody's concerned with that. All of a sudden now we're concerned with it. I'll tell you even further that sometimes people would say, oh, this is, this is like some modern PC kind of thing, So then I wanted to look into this and say, okay, so actually, where did this come from? So, everyone says it. It's like a known thing, but where is it actually from? That's how the whole thing started.
Wow. And it's not like Haggadot are obscure books. Like they are,
right.
They're perhaps one of the most central, sort of Jewish books there are.
Yes. And I'll tell you the way I actually researched this is I took 3 students of mine and we went to libraries in Yerushalayim. We literally took every Haggadah off the shelf, looked up what it said over there, and documented it. And we just physically went through reams of Haggadot. And, I divided them into categories, who they attributed to. And that it was, and the 3 were basically anonymous, Abarbanel, or Avudraham. For example, the YU student organization of Yeshiva, YU Haggadah, they have Abarbanel. I believe that the Rabbi Sachs Haggadah has Avudraham. And then, and everyone in between, Art Scroll sometimes has, it depends which edition, sometimes it has either or none. So there you go. So it's like a whole,
Wow, that's so funny. So it was sort of murky
yes,
origins.
Very murky, and it had to be, we had to get through the murk.
Yeah, so it originally had this sort of negative connotation vis-a-vis Gentile neighbors, sort of taking the droppings out. So
and I'll tell you, I just want to say that the early, if you look at the Mishnah Brura, gives an explanation for it also, which is hilarious because the Mishnah Brura gives an explanation that nobody ever quotes. He says because 16 represents the Yud and the Vav of Hashem's name. And it was, Hashem made the makot, so that's what we do, Yud Vav. I don't know if this is the most, exciting explanation, but that's what the Mishnah Brura says. So he provides it. It's funny, he provides an explanation, and, nobody cares about that explanation. And if you look in all the old Minhagim books from the late 1800s and early 1900s, like Sefer Ta'amei HaMinhagim, that a lot of people have at home, this like fat Minhag book, there they always say that the wine, you take out drops to represent the Egyptians getting diminished with each makkah, which is the opposite vibe, right? You're representing the lessening of the Egyptians. Is exactly the opposite vibe. So the question was like, how did it all flip? Where did the flip happen? How did that happen?
Tracing back chronologically, where does this all start?
There is a concept that might be connected to this idea of diminished joy. That concept is found in the Gemara. The Gemara has an idea in Masechet Megillah. It appears on Daf Yud Amud Bet. It also appears in Masechet Sanhedrin on Daf Lamed Tet Amud Bet. That during Kriyat Yam Suf, when the Egyptians were getting killed in Kriyat Yam in the Yam Suf, drowned, the angels wanted to sing, and Hashem says, "Hey, my creatures, my handiwork is getting destroyed. How can you sing? It's not okay that you sing." So that appears in the Gemara. And this also appears in the Shibulei Haleket, which is quoted by Rav Yosef Karo in the Beit Yosef as a reason that during Chol HaMoed Pesach, we don't do the full Hala. So there is a bit of a concept like this. However, we have to understand that the Gemara is talking about the angels not singing. The Jewish people were singing, they were singing Az Yashir, and that's totally okay. So it seems that, at least from the Gemara's perspective, the angels are chastised, they weren't oppressed, so don't sing when someone's getting killed, right? But the Jewish people who were themselves oppressed is not considered bad. That's number one. But the Shibulei Haleket still brings this idea regarding the half hollow. Again, we also have to, though, note that on the 7th day of Pesach, we do say a full halal. We say a full halal at the Seder. We do say halal. We do, in shul, some shul say it Friday, at the night of Pesach too. So it's a little bit of a, complicated thing. And also the Gemara in Arachin says that the real reason you don't say a full halal is because there's not a different korban as there is on Sukkot. So there's a halachic reason. But there is a little bit of an idea like that. There's a little bit of an idea, but nobody applied it to the wine. No one applied that. But again, we have to be honest that there is an idea. Now, where you start seeing this explanation is in English language Haggadot.
So not prior to English language Haggadot?
Oh, okay. So we will get to a little bit prior, but this is where it takes off.
Which is obviously very fascinating because this is an English language publication, and that is also. Yes. So there is a Haggadah, the Schlesinger Haggadah from 1929, which later they became Sinai Publishing. They give this explanation. They give this explanation with no attribution whatsoever, but they give it. So it's in an English language. That's why, by the way, Rabbi Drew, if you ask around, it's usually Americans who know this more than Israelis, because it appears much more in American and English language Haggadot. It also appears in, now here's where it got really famous. There was Rabbi David de Solapul, who, if you remember as a kid, using the de Solapul siddur in shul sometimes, the shul that, the siddur that would start with Friday night davening. That's how it was arranged. He and his wife put together a Haggadah for U.S. soldiers in 1943, a little Haggadah for armed services. And this Haggadah, you can imagine, it's a tiny little Haggadah for soldiers to use, has basically no explanations. The only thing that they explain is this. And what's funny is that in this Haggadah was meant for a wide spectrum of American type people, American Jewish people, from all across the religious spectrum. And it was specifically meant to be in accordance with American values. So from those early English language Haggadot, it basically appears in every English language Haggadah that has explanations. There's the Birnbaum, Philip Birnbaum, very famous Haggadah, 1953. It goes on and on and on from there. So that's how it got super, super popular. So the question then becomes, so wait a second, where did the 1929 Haggadah, get it from? But we're going to diverge for 1 second because the earliest source that attributes it to Abarbanel is a Warsaw newspaper in 1937. Now, this Warsaw newspaper had a Dvar Torah column in it, and it's von unser alten Oitzer, which is like from our old treasure house. It would bring Divrei Torah, and there it was written by someone called Moshe Bunim Yustman, and he brings this explanation in the pre-Pesach issue of 1937, and there he says it is the Abarbanel. So he's the earliest one I found who says it's Abarbanel. So again, 1929 and on, it's just anonymous. 1937, he says it's Abarbanel. Now, those articles were then collected and put into a Hebrew collection called Mi'otzratenu Hayashan, from our old treasure, which is really a translation. And that's how Hebrew speakers got to know it. From there, it appears in the Kitov Haggadah from Eliyahu Kitov. And from there, it goes into Art Scroll. And from Art Scroll, it's everywhere. And if you look carefully in Art Scroll, you could see that it's basically the same thing as Kitov, which is the same thing as Motzratenu Hayashan. That's how Abarbanel got spread.
With spring arriving, that means Passover is right around the corner. To help provide you insights and more into Jewish drinking At this time of year, where else to turn to than JewishDrink.com? In addition to multiple episodes over the course of multiple years of episodes of the Jewish Drinking Show, there are also resources at JewishDrink.com to provide insights, whether it's articles and more. Feel free to check out JewishDrink.com/Passover to check out those resources. L'chaim.
And I'm just going to say to all the researchers out there, here's a tip. When anyone quotes anything, look it up to make sure that it's actually what they say. Yes? Because, people sometimes they don't have the time or patience and they say, okay, he said it's there, so it's going to be there. Yes? Okay. So now what do we know? We know that from the 1920s, people are saying this explanation. We know that from the 1930s, people are already saying that it's a barbanel. And what's even funnier is that people were claiming, oh, this is like PC, not from stuff.
Yeah.
The thing is that in the Reform Haggadot themselves, they say that Rabbi Herbert Bronstein in 1974, he invented the idea in the Reform Haggadah. So they themselves claim ownership to it. But all the listeners already know that's 1974. This is a long time after all this.
Yeah.
So the real earliest source for this is a rabbi called Rabbi Edward Baneth. Also in Hebrew, he's called Yechezkel, and his last name is Bennett. You could say Bennett. But in English, they say Edward Baneth, and he died in 1930. Now, he was an Orthodox rabbi, but he was a bit of a, an edgy figure a little bit. Now, because he taught in the University for the Study of Judaism in Berlin. So he was like an early, scholarly, rabbi type figure, Nowadays, what he's kind of most famous for is that one of his students was Regina Jonas, who was considered to be the first woman rabbi ever. And she was a student. He didn't give her semikha or anything, but she was a student of his. Now, he gave a speech. He gave a lecture on the Seder, and this was published in Berlin in 1904. And this lecture was one of the very, very first kind of academic approaches to the Haggadah. But it's not it's like the early time of working all this stuff out, right? Early 1900s. And in this, and it's not really 100% like a dry lecture. It has like some neshama to it, And in it, he says that when he was young, when he was still a boy, he heard this explanation. So here in 1904, he reports this explanation. And he even says, it's an open question whether this is historically true, but it has the spirit of Yiddishkeit in it. So he himself knew, as he's saying it to the audience there, that it's like a new thing and all of that. So 1904 is the earliest explanation that is written down that has this. Now, now what we have to understand is, so where did Edward, he says he heard it as a boy. So where did he hear it as a boy?
Yeah.
Okay. So now what happens is there's a Rabbi Eliyahu Klatskin. Now, Rabbi Eliyahu Klatskin, there's a 3-year age difference between him and Rabbi Baneth. Okay, so they're contemporaries, and he gives this explanation also in a work of his, which is called Kuntras Ledugma. Now, Kuntras Ledugma is a great book because it's a 24-page book of things that he wrote that didn't fit into any other sefer. So it's kind of like miscellaneous stuff. And he didn't want it to just go to waste. And he writes this explanation too. The thing is that Kuntras Ledugma comes out in the 1920s. So it's after Rabbi Baneth, but he reports it too. So what do we see? That two contemporaries at the same time are reporting this thing.
Yeah.
So it was in the air somehow in the early 1900s. But again, since his book was put out in 1921, like the earliest dated one is still Edward Bannon. He's still the one. But again, it's around the same time. It's around the same time. However, there's another book, and this book is called Divrei Yirmiyahu. Now, the Sefer Divrei Yirmiyahu is a collection of drashot from a Hungarian rabbi called Rav Yirmiyahu Low. Rav Yirmiyahu Low, he died in 1874. So we can say he's like a generation before Rabbi Klatskin and Rabbi Bannon. In this, now this book is a collection of drashot, which is a great, very nice thing. His grandson, Rav Binyamin Low, put together this collection. And, nice, very prominent Hungarian rabbinical family. Now, at the end of the book, and this is what they would do in the olden days, when the folios would come out and then you get like blanks at the end. So because it's like 8 or however, it comes out.
Yeah.
So they would put extra material there. In the extra material, at the end of Divrei Yirmiyahu, Rav Binyamin Zev Low says that his grandfather, Rav Yirmiyahu Low, who's the author, that's the book of his drashot, he came up with this explanation. And that is actually, he's the real earliest source. Now, again, this book, since it was put out by Rav Yirmiyahu Low's grandson, only comes out after Rabbi Edward Bannon. But again, he's a figure, he's a named figure, and he came before and he says it. And he even writes, he has a nice line that he says that this represents the extra rachamim, the extra element of mercy that Jewish people have, in the sense that, it's clearly not, legally mandated that you have to feel this way about your enemies. It's totally fine if you don't feel that way, but, going above and beyond, this is what it is. So that's Divrei Yirmiyahu in the end of that sefer. That's where it started. But from Edward Bannon, that's where everybody knew it from. Now, the thing is, here's the trick. The Low and Bannon families are very, very intertwined. They were intertwined through marriage relationships, through Rebbe Talmud relationships, through different rabbinical figures writing haskamas on each other's sfarim. So my understanding is that when Rabbi Bannon says that he heard this as a boy, it trickled to his family from the Low family, which they knew and were in contact with. Yeah. So if we want to say, where did it all start? It started with a very serious Hungarian Orthodox rabbi from the late 1800s, Rav Yirmiyahu Low. Then it gets to Rabbi Bannon, who gives it in this speech, and from there it goes everywhere. And so he's really the one that got it out there.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far on something regarding wine at the Seder. Well, here's a sneak peek into next week's episode, also on a similar wine at the Seder topic.
He says it's not really that often that people are drinking that much or necessarily getting that drunk between 1 and 2. That's why they're putting on in rabbinic literature. They didn't talk about it because how common is this that people are getting drunk that early on in the Seder?
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Now back into this episode.
Now we can understand why people attribute it to the Abarbanel. Now, because who do people attribute it to? Either the Abarbanel or the Avudraham. Now, what did the Abarbanel and Avudraham have in common? They lived more than 100 years apart. The only thing they have in common is the first 2 letters of their name. Abarbanel, Aleph Bet, and Avudraham, Aleph Bet. You know what? It just so happens that the initials of Edward Bannon, Aleph Bet. So therefore, I have not found exactly where that happens, but this is my theory that someone recorded this chidush that they heard, from the speech. They wrote it down. I heard it from Rav Aleph Bet. Now, someone looks at Aleph Bet and they think, who could it be writing on the Haggadah? Abarbanel is a good choice. That's a good, easy one to go to, Avudraham, why not? He writes commentary on Tefillah. That's the whole book over there.
Yeah.
So, and that's where Avud Raham and Abarbanel came from. But really, it is our friend Edward Baneth that everybody's quoting. And this, I would say that to the degree that anyone in the audience here, I would say that your listeners, the viewers, I am sure that close to somewhere in the upper 90% have heard this explanation, our joy is diminished. What percentage of them ever heard of Edward Baneth? Probably the flip side of that ratio, to get to 100.
So I'm kind of curious. How were you able to tie Rabbi Baneth to the 1930s and on with those explanations?
In terms of
or how did you even find the Rabbi Baneth? How did you find those references?
I'll tell you, because the fact is that there's a scholar, Rabbi Daniel Goldschmidt. He's a scholar that he would do a lot of research on tefillah and piyutim. And he wrote a lot on Haggadot. And in his 1946 edition, where he discusses the Haggadah, he mentions this in a note there. And he said, and then you just find, and there it is. So he's the one.
He mentions Rabbi Baneth.
He says that he heard that people say it, but it's really very recent, and it's Edward Baneth. He says he also writes Rav Shimshon Rafal Hirsch, but I haven't been able to find that Rav Shimshon Rafal Hirsch says it anywhere. So I think I would say it's really, Edward Baneth, he said it. So he's the one that we'll pin it to, and in his circles, and it just grew from there. It really grew from there, and that's I would say. Now the thing is, though, that clearly this resonated with people. Clearly over time, like somehow this explanation, I don't know, rang true to people. And that's why it completely replaced the original explanation of the 16 bladed sword of God, and even the Mishnah Berurah's explanation of Shem Hashem, or that the Egyptians are being diminished, which is interesting. Something happened to the psyche of Am Yisrael that they have this kind of an attitude was considered to be appropriate. But again, we have to mention that it caught on mostly in America. And not as much in Israel.
So I have two questions. One is, it's fascinating that it actually sprouts in Germany, but it doesn't really take root until America. And I'm not really surprised about World War II, because that was definitely a time where Jews, they felt very accepted and definitely
America and all this.
It's interesting that it didn't make it in any of the German language Haggadot.
But that
in the 1930s, I understand why it couldn't happen. It appeared in that
Warsaw newspaper, right? It appeared in that Warsaw newspaper. That's in the 1930s, so it did appear there, and that's where things moved from. I would listen. I'm going to say sort of as follows, that it is because there wasn't the mechanism for it really to continue in Europe, in those years. So I'm actually in the Warsaw newspaper, and then it's sort of, can't go on.
Right. I'm not surprised about it not taking root in the 1930s. I'm actually surprised, since it was in writing in 1904, maybe that decade or even the subsequent decade, it could have. That's the more surprising, not the 1930s.
Right. So I'll tell you what it is. But you know what somebody would have to do? But this is the trick. There had to be someone who takes an explanation that was given as a college lecture in the Berlin, Judaism college, and then bring it into the world of regular Hamish Frumkeit. And I think a little bit that's why they either don't, it can't be that other people don't know that it was Edward Baneth. But I would say that a lot of books, they're going to quote him. It could be that it's not so shy for them to quote him. It could be that way. Or people don't even bother, during the research. That's also probably a big factor. But again, you're taking someone from the academic world and you're bringing that explanation into the Hamish world, which even today, I don't know how much, I don't know if there's a lot of crossover that way. There's certain people, that you all know. There's those guys in shul that are the crossover people, but the regular civilians, they have their own, swarm that they read, and they don't get involved in the academic stuff.
Hey there, I want to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
I'm kind of curious, and I know you mentioned in America, English language Haggadot in America. What about English Haggadot in England or other Anglophonic countries? Was it as early? Was it later?
Yeah, I found a little bit that it made it into also British Haggadot and even some French Haggadot. I was able to find that it spread over there.
Oh, wow.
But
a little bit later. Probably a little bit later,
and it didn't have the same like steamroller impact. That like it basically dominates in America. It becomes the dominant kind of an approach. And even to the degree that you look to get today, I just looked, for example, today in an Israeli Haggadah, contemporary one.
Yeah.
And they gave the traditional thing that the Egyptians are diminished. So even today, it didn't make those inroads, and I think that if, you hang around in Israel and you ask like real, Israelis about it, I don't know if they're necessarily going to have this diminished joy interpretation.
Wow. So it's really primarily took root in the last 80, 90 years, specifically in America.
Right?
Wow.
It trickles into other places, but it's really, and I'll tell you, I think a gigantic, from interacting with students about this, also, it becomes the explanation in the Art Scroll Children's Haggadah. And there seems to be now these teenagers who grew up on that Haggadah, and that's their point of reference too. So there's like a coming up with this. But I'll tell you, listen, I'm not saying, it's a good explanation. There's a lot of explanations. You get to whatever you want. And that's part of what Haggadahs are, Every generation, you see yourself coming out of Egypt, and you take your own spin on it, and that's fine. But what's interesting is that it's not a PC thing. Like it, Rabbi Low in the 1800s was not a PC guy. He was not a PC rabbi. He was involved in, fights against Hasidim. He was involved in, dealing with early Zionism. He was involved in the neologues. He fought with people. He was, he was a tough customer. He's not like some sort of, walking around with a guitar singing, peace and love.
Yeah.
But again, he said this is reflective of the mercy of the Jewish people, which is interesting because I think that he was right in the sense that because we're so merciful, everyone loves this explanation. Like that, that's what, because of that whole concept.
Were there any other surprises along the research way?
The real surprise to me was how many people quoted it and say that it is somebody who it just isn't if you look it up. That's what I thought. I felt like that's ridiculous. And now, I'm gonna say it anonymously, but I over the years I met a person who was in charge of working on one of those Haggadot, and and I indicated to him, about that you're right, this is not really accurate, the attribution, and the response I got was complete indifference. So that was also a little bit of a thing. Like,
wow,
it's almost as if I thought, if then in the next edition, just right, like in the other Haggadahs, some say, or don't say it for Bantu, don't say that, say so. But it was a little bit surprising how much people didn't even care to try to correct the error, which is, if it's an error, you correct it. I mean, that's what, these Haggadahs, they put out new editions all the time, right? You can that's the bread and butter of these things. That's the bread and butter. I'm telling you, all you researchers out there listening, and all you just look up the sources, look it up, and just see that people say what they actually are supposed to be saying. And these are sfarm that are accessible to people. It's not like, Avood Ram, people have it, everyone has that. It's not
that's great. All right. This has been so fascinating, enlightening, and this has been great. Before we go,
I want to say something.
Yeah,
I want to say something.
Yeah.
That I myself, I'm not a drinking guy.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, how in the world am I ever going to get on the Jewish drinking show? But there you go. So dreams can come true. So
there you go. It's going to be hard to follow that. Okay. So before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
I'm going to have a book coming out from Koren.
Oh, nice.
And it's going to come out shortly in a couple of weeks, and it's going to be called Jewish Customs. That's a very exciting title, it just grabs you. Jewish Customs.
Wow.
And in it, I will talk about this and a lot of other, comment, to get to the bottom of a lot of things that everybody takes for granted. That's what I like to do.
How many of them are wine or drinking related?
How many are wine or drinking related? I think this was it. I think.
Oh, okay. All right. One is good enough.
If there's a bread, a bread podcast, the Jewish eating show, so we can go there.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, this has been fantastic. This has been great. Thank you so much, and l'chaim.
L'chaim. Thank you very much. Have a Chag Sameach, everybody.